Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me this evening as we start a new series of shiurim, of talks. 2020, I don't need to tell anyone, was a dark year. And within, I guess, the blanketing of the darkness, when we lost many, we also lost a number of senior Jewish leaders, rabbinic leaders from across the Jewish spectrum. But as many have pointed out, I think the modern Orthodox Dati Le'umi world was perhaps hit harder than others. In a way, we've emerged from the year 2020 having lost, if not all, many of the real senior rabbinic leaders within our community. And this series is going to look at some of them, talk about some of the leaders. I've picked four. Tonight with Rabinovitch, next week Rabbi Dr. Nahum, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sack, and finally with Rabbi Steinsaltz. This is not a eulogy. We're not going to talk about their lives. We might start each time a little overview, because maybe not everyone is familiar with their biography, who they were, the institutions they were part of, the works they produced. We'll briefly go over that. But perhaps to make it more bright and to, as Chazal tell us, the great ones live on. That we put a Beis HaMedrash over their grave. They live on through their writing, through their work, through their Torah, through their thought. And thank God, all these people have left us indeed with a huge amount of literature, of svarim, of thought. They are great because they made a great impact, not only because of their great personalities, what they knew, but what they imparted to the Jewish community, to the Jewish world, the knowledge, the Torah, the teachings, the example that they were. And therefore, we'll explore, rather than them and their lives that's gone, we'll explore perhaps some of their ideas, some of the most famous and impactful ideas that live on well beyond their lives. So I'm going to share the screen. I created a little PowerPoint. How do I get? Anyone knows how I can share? How do I do full screen? Is it F5? Something like that? Does anyone know how I do a slideshow? One's muted.
Yeah, Rabbi Shmuley, just to the bottom of your computer, where it's got it's to the right, a bit more to the right, a bit more. Next one, there. Great. One. Press
Thank
that.
you. Thank you so much. Okay, we are ready to go. Okay, so tonight's one is Dr. Nahum Eliezer Rabinovitch. That's his name, and we're going to explore when we get to it his essay, which was expanded, became a book title, but it's really an essay, a 35-page essay called Darko Shel Torah. So next slide. So just some biographical details of Rabbi Nahum Rabinovitch. He was born in 1928 in Montreal in Canada. So he's probably of the first generation of non-Eastern European Gedolim, really born in America, North American, born and raised Torah giants. Being from Montreal, he had the luck of living close to Rav Pinchas Hirschsprung. So Rav Pinchas Hirschsprung was the chief rabbi of Montreal. He was someone who had come from Eastern Europe, had grown up, and already had gained a reputation. He was the bochein in the yeshiva of Lublin, Chachmei Lublin, Rav Meir Shapira, the famous Rav Meir Shapira, who was the founder of Daf Hayomi, the member of the Polish parliament. So he built one of the first modern yeshivas, as we said. It wasn't the first modern yeshiva, was Volozhin in that way, but modern yeshiva in the sense that it was one building, an institution which had everything under one roof, the Beis HaMedrash, dorming, food, everything under one roof, really magnificent structure. If you go to Lublin today, it's still standing. It really wasn't, would have been today a multi-million dollar project. So Rav Pinchas Hirschsprung, to get into the yeshiva, had very high standards. He had to know 200 pages of Gemara off by heart. Rav Pinchas Hirschsprung was known as an Eloi, as a genius. He could do the pin test. You put the pin in one side of the Gemara, in one page of Gemara, and he could tell you where the pin's going to go through page after page. A real genius who came to Montreal, was the rabbi in Montreal. It really was, for those who knew him, he wasn't so well known, but for those who knew him, was really one of the major rabbinic figures in America in the early, not really just the early 20th century, throughout the 20th century. Of Herschel Schechter, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University in the Rosh Kollel, today really probably the leading posek in definitely modern Orthodox America, just generally in America. His Sfarim, if you look in his early Sfarim, he got his approbation, the Haskama from Rav Pinchas Hirschsprung. I heard a great story from Rav Shechter that he sent Rav Hirschsprung the manuscript for him to write the Haskama, to write the approbation. And he gave approbation. And then once the book was printed, Rav Shechter sent it along with his son. Was going up to Montreal on a school trip, and he wanted to send the finished book to Rav Hirschsprung as a thank you for writing the Haskama, the approbation. He got back word from Rav Hirschsprung. Rav Hirschsprung wanted to know why he had changed 3 things from the manuscript to the final edition of the Sefer. That's just the genius of Rav Hirschsprung, to be able to pick up on that nuance, the 3 small changes he made. And Rav Hirschsprung gave sort of Nahum Rabinovitch, learned with Rav Hirschsprung for 6 years, and he gave him smicha at the young age of 20. So clearly he saw him as a prodigy, as a talented and smart, clever young man. He left Montreal, moved down, traveled down to Baltimore in America, and he learned in Ner Yisrael. So Ner Yisrael, for those who are not familiar, it's one of the early yeshivas in America, founded, I think, between the wars by Rav Ruderman, and it's became, and is today, one of the major American yeshivas. It was at its start, and still continues to be in some form, a yeshiva that is, I guess, more towards the center. That it's obviously got full-time yeshiva studies and a kollel and rabbinic courses, but it also always had an option, or at least a loose affiliation with Johns Hopkins University and other local universities that the young men would both go to yeshiva and also study. So Nahum Rabinovitch learned in Ner Yisrael under Rav Ruderman. He received another smicha for Rav Ruderman. And whilst he was there, like many other young men did, he earned a degree from Johns Hopkins University, a major university in America, in mathematics. And there he married Ruth Shuchatovitz, who is a niece of Rav Ruderman. So again, it's a demonstration of the esteem he was held in, that obviously was suggested to marry the Rosh Yeshiva's niece. 1952, he moved out of, he actually went to Texas on the way, but he took up his first major rabbinic posting in Charleston, South Carolina. So not necessarily well-known community, but he was the rabbi there for some 9 years, and he established the first Jewish school. And in 1963, he moved back to his home country, to Canada, not to Montreal, but this time Toronto, where he became the rabbi to a large community. And whilst he was in Toronto, he earned his PhD in mathematics at the University of Toronto. And then whilst he was the rabbi in America, he also served as deputy editor of Hadarom. So Hadarom is the rabbinic journal of the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America. So it's, again, prestigious position, and he could showcase. He wrote many articles both for Hadarom and some in Tradition and other places, showcase already his vast Torah knowledge and his eloquence as well. Tafat more well known to many in England. That's why Nahum Rabinovitch, interestingly, when he passed away, this is often the case. There's a proliferation of writing about him, and people become familiar too often with people once they passed away. Once people write about how we've lost someone so great, people start to recognize who was this person, who was the person we lost. So he wasn't necessarily so well known outside the rabbinic circles, outside those who were in the know, maybe those who were outside Israel. In Israel, he was more in the Dati Le'umi world, as we'll see, a more well-known figure, having been there for the last 40 or so years, and perhaps, as it is in the Jewish community, our leaders are those who rise to fame or to prominence is often later in life. Chazal tell us that the others grew old and they yoshev yeshivas. In old age, if someone gains wisdom and knowledge, and that Torah knowledge expands, and they sort of rise up to become a prolific authority, a halachic authority, a posek, and a leader. So Rabbi Nahum Rabinovitch's years as a leader, as really a prominent halachist, came in Israel as he in his later years in life, in the later decades in life. But there was an important stint he spent in London. That's why perhaps more familiar of those, or at least of a certain age, here in the UK, on English shores, because he, on the invitation of the chief rabbi at the time, Roger Kovovitz, who was looking for an impressive figure, someone who would catch the imagination and catch the attention of Anglo Jewry to lead up Jews College, which at the time was an underfunded and waning institution, probably always was. Um, Many of the chief rabbis I was reading, Hertz already, before him, Adler, bemoaned the fact that the Anglo-Jewry didn't support Jews College enough, and Anglo-Jewry never really produced rabbinic sages, rabbinic scholars at the same rate as there was happening in other places in America and Europe at the time, Germany obviously in Adler's time, and in America at Hertz's time. So in 1971, to try to boost, and near the beginning of his chief rabbinate, to try to boost the stature of Jews College, Rabbi Lord Jukovitch, Chief Rabbi Lord Jukovitch, invited Nahum Rabinovitch over to England to lead the college. And he was there for 12 years, and he did raise up the standards. Amongst his students was none other than Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. So to him, he became his Rabbi Muvag, his most formative and major teacher. And if you're familiar with the writings of Rabbi Sachs, it's a lot of the ideas of Nahum Rabinovitch, and the one we're going to discuss today is definitely something you'll find in Rabbi Sachs's writing. He draws a lot from his learning and from that which he gained from Nahum Rabinovitch. Interestingly, from what I believe, he only gave samicha to 5 students. He was really a very demanding mentor and teacher. He had very high standards. To get samicha from Jewish College at the time, I think I heard once, I think from Rabbi Sachs even, that he would make the students write an 80-page response, a rabbinic response on a halachic topic. That's no small feat. We're talking about a major undertaking, a major achievement. He was a very exacting, had high standards for his students, and that's maybe why he only ordained such a small amount of students. And in 1983, he was invited to move to Israel to become Rosh Yeshiva, then a fledgling yeshiva. So the story goes in the 70s, when he was a rabbi in England, he was the head of Jews College, I should say. He was invited a number of times to go to Israel. England being closer than America, he was invited to come speak at various places, and he was in Yeshivat HaKotel. Was 2 older students in the yeshiva, Rav Sabata and Rav Shilat, heard him when they went and founded their own yeshiva, Birchat Moshe in Ma'ale Adumim, a number of years later. And they needed a Rosh Yeshiva. They were young men in their late 20s, early 30s at the time, founding a new Hesder Yeshiva with a slightly new twang and style to it. They needed a prominent figure, a Talmid Chacham of repute, someone who could serve as a Rosh Yeshiva. So they invited Rabbi Nahum Rabinovitch to come and be the Rosh Yeshiva. They joined him as Rosh Yeshiva in the early 2000s. So for 15, 18 years, he ran it, the Rosh Yeshiva as his own, and they joined him as the Rosh Yeshiva. As I said, for 40 years, he was in Ma'ale Adumim as Rosh Yeshiva of Birchat Moshe. And he really had the greatest impact on world Jewry through a number of many students. And as I said, he rose to prominence as a major figure in the Dati Leumi world. I read an article after the passing of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, who really was the senior figure, at least the senior Rosh Yeshiva in the Dati Leumi world. And many were saying nowadays Rav Nahum Rabinovitch took over that mantle, even though he was probably slightly older than Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, but that was the stature of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein and his influence through his yeshiva Har Etzion. But after his passing, perhaps the person that the Dati Leumi world looked to as the senior Rosh Yeshiva was none other than Rav Nahum Rabinovitch. Sadly, he died, as we know, in April 2020 at the age, I think, 92 or 93, it was reported. I say he was a leading posek in the Dati Leumi community. It's very interesting. In an article, Rabbi Lau, who really is very much in that world, is from the Dati Leumi world. He wrote in an article of Srugim that Niftar of Nahum Rabinovitch, I've got the quote here, Ish Shel Torah, described him as a man of Torah. So he say, Ma Omer La'adam Koteret HaMachtira Ota B'chtur. Now if people are saying that they're crowning him with the accolade of the Zakein Rabbanei HaTzionot HaDatit, as the elder rabbi of the religious Zionist world, he said that it actually diminishes the one who's deceased. It diminishes Rav Nahum Rabinovitch, perhaps over politicizes him. He actually goes further. To give him a title of a Dati Leumi, religious Zionist elder rabbi leader, is a disservice to him. He felt that as a man of Torah, he really transcended that particular world, that particular community. And the truth is, if we just saw his educational background, his own personal journey, he didn't come through the Hesder Yeshiva. He's not a product of Yeshiva University or a student of Moshe Soloveitchik or his son of Joseph B. Soloveitchik. He came and learned by the Gedolim great rabbis of Eastern Europe, Rav Hirschsprung, Rav Ruderman, not from the not from the modern Orthodox world. He learned in those yeshivas. He also learned by Rav Henkin, one of the poskim in America. Over time, through his own education, through his own exposure, through his own life journey, he became associated with more the modern Orthodox Dati Leumi world and looked towards by that community as a leader. But he wasn't necessarily a product or limited to that world. He perhaps transcended that specific community. In terms of his works, in terms of his published works, his magnus opus was for sure his Yad Peshuta, which is a commentary on the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, Rambam's 14-volume summation of all halacha, of all of Torah. So Rav Nahum Rabinovitch went about and writing a Yad Peshuta, a commentary on it, on all 14 books. It's really quite incredible. It draws on both his Torah knowledge, Vestridis Torah knowledge, but also his academic knowledge. He dealt a lot with different manuscripts of the Rambam. His scientific knowledge, his mathematical knowledge helped him in a lot of areas of the Rambam. His philosophical training, understanding the Rambam's Moira, the guide for perplexed, Rambam's more philosophical side. So that was definitely his magnus opus. But he also wrote a book of rabbinic responsa, the Shut Siach Nahum, literally the discussion of Nahum, put together by his students, came out about 10, 15 years ago. Again, the fact that he has a book of responsa, of halachic responsa, again, speaks to the fact that he was a recognized, sought after posek, halachic authority, meaning the fact people were writing to him, asking him serious, cutting edge halachic questions. He was writing back, and then there was a thirst, there was a demand for this to be put into a book and used and drawn upon. Again, not every rabbi passing shaylas is putting out books of response and that become part of the canon, become discussed, and therefore again bespeaks to his greatness. And in the more on, he did write books of philosophy, of machshava, Darker Shal Torah. As I said, the discussion, it's an essay, but it became extended to the title of a book. Again, he wrote Parokim Machshava, Halacha Vaktulia. So it's things in Hashkafa. Just again, the type of posek he was. So you see here, this is the contents page, part of the contents page of his halachic responsa. So you can see, that from the type of questions he was grappling with and answering, and obviously the type of questions that were put on his table rather than other tables, again, does speak to a rabbinic leadership that was a broad one and that spanned across the spectrum of the Jewish world and dealt with questions of those perhaps who are less entrenched within the religious community. For instance, he has questions like Hanachat tefillin al ketovet ka'aka b'mechoeret, putting tefillin on top of a sort of, I guess, a lewd tattoo. So again, obviously that's coming from a certain type of place. Praying, tefillah b'mechnasaim gesarim, praying with short trousers. Again, obviously in certain communities where there's a very strict dress code, that's not even a question. He grapples with obviously communities in Israel where people dress more casually, and shorts and t-shirt is the dress of the summer everywhere. Is it acceptable to dress with short trousers? Again, another one. Yudal birchat hagomel l'shev mishirut miluim, the blessing of hagomel when you come back from doing miluim, doing army service. Again, that's only a question that's going to come from certain communities. Many others, finally, perhaps a little bit more of a controversial one. Mem is Rikud Nashim im Sefer Torah. He wrote a responsa. I think he's one of the very few who wrote a response about women dancing with the Sefer Torah on Simchas Torah. Not the discussion today, what he says, perhaps another time.
Out of interest, What did he say about short trousers? I've got to ask.
What did he say about short trousers? He said that, in a nutshell, he basically said where it is the accepted normative dress of that community, and that is how people would, interact with important and special people, then that would be permitted. He does have a slight caveat with that. The chazan leading the community, and the question is what is acceptable to the community. So again, it has to be something which the community deems to be appropriate and formal enough. So again, it will depend on various communities. Yeah. Okay. Well, as I said, I wanted to study together one of his essays, an important essay, which was for me. I was aware of it. I ran to it again more recently. It frames many important questions for us as Jews grappling with the modern world, with the modern experience, how we look at Torah, certain elements of Torah which perhaps are challenging to us, are difficult to us to understand. And I think he takes a really novel, in a way, a radical view on this. He gives us a pathway, he gives us a framework to think about many elements of Torah. Again, it comes with a caveat, and hopefully we'll get to it and speak to it about it more. We'll quote from him that he's not giving us carte blanche. There's not a license to take some of these ideas and run with them to places he would have never have envisioned, which is not appropriate. Again, this, we're not going to do it due justice. He can marshal, and he does marshal an incredible breadth and depth of sources from across, Torah and the works of the rabbinic works, and the way he puts them together, very novel in some ways. So he obviously has the license and the ability to come up and formulate this approach and this framework, and it doesn't necessarily extend to everything, but it definitely gives us a very useful key when it comes to certain questions. This was the introductory paragraph, very interesting introductory paragraph, which we're not going to go through. I want to go through texts together. I think in learning, you could read the article. I can share the article with those who want online. It's in English. It's translated. It was written originally in Hebrew, and it was translated into English from the Eidah Journal. What I wanted to do is to learn it together, to study through some of the sources he brings inside, and to see where we come out with. Interestingly, he begins with a sort of as an opener this medrash in the Shmos Rabbah that talks about how God tells the Jewish people to light a lamp in the menorah in the temple, to light the candelabra. What does God need us to light a lamp? He said the Medrash says it's a parable to two people walking in the dark, one who is blind and one who is sighted. And the sighted person asked the blind person to light a candle for him. The sighted person, asked the blind person to light the candle for him. So the Medrash said that is the same with us and God. God is the sighted individual. He doesn't need, the light, but nonetheless, he asks us to light for him a light, just as he lighted for us a light, because he does indeed want our input. He wants God says, indeed, I have lit the path for you. I gave you the Torah. I brought you into existence. I gave you a light, a moral code, a path through life. So too you shall light a light for me. Okay. Where he really starts is with a fundamental point, and actually something that's pertinent to this week's parsha. This week's parsha, the discussion is a lot about the free will of Pharaoh. How could God harden Pharaoh's heart and to bring the plagues, and to definitely after the first 5, the latter 5, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. What happened to Pharaoh's free will? A fundamental of Judaism is free will. This is the Rambam in Hilchos Teshuv, the laws of repentance. Reshus l'chol adam yasuna. Permission is given to every individual. If he wants to turn himself to the good way, and to be a righteous person, permission is in his hand. If one person wants to turn to the evil way, and to be a wicked person, the whole man is like one of us. He is he's knowing of good and evil, meaning we have free will. God has endowed us with free will to choose either the good or to choose the bad. That is what actually means when the Torah tells us back in Parshas Bereshis, in the very beginning of the Torah, in the 6th day of creation, God says, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. God speaking to the angel, but God's talking about himself. Man is going to be B'Tselem Elokim, the next verse, in the image of God. What does it mean in the image of God? That's the Sepharno. Sepharno is the early modern commentator of the Torah, from northern Italy, Renaissance Italy. How is man comparable to God? How can man, finite human beings, be comparable to the infinite God? In the small way we are, it's through the ability of free choice. God's free choice is eternal, it's much greater, it's absolute, and it's always for the good. He always chooses good. By definition, if God chooses it, it's good. Not so to man's choice. Our choice is somewhat more limited. we don't have ultimate power, infinite power, therefore our choice can't be infinite. And secondly, we don't always choose good. We sometimes choose wrong. And that is indeed the famous Gemara in Talmud Bavli in Sanhedrin, that when God wants to make man, he creates a group of angels. Is it your will that we should create man? Master of the universe, what are the deeds of this man? God says to these angels, so and so will be man's deeds. So the angel said to him, it's a mistake. Quoting from a verse and saying, what is man that you shall remember him? Ben Adam kisif kedenu, and the son of man that kisif kedenu, that you should appoint him. So God puts his finger amongst them and destroys it. Meaning the angels were saying, why create man? He's fickle. Someone's chatting me. He's fickle. He's fickle, and he makes mistakes. Why would you create him? Okay, in Kashnia, God again, second group of angels are created. They object to the creation of man, and God gets rid of them. The third group of angels say before God, the first one, they said before you, what was their help? The whole world is yours, God. Anything you want to do. Meaning, they knew better. The third group of angels, God consults with, so to speak. And again, we're not analyzing this text per se. And again, as a student of Rabinovitch, Rabbi Sachs often comes back to this passage in the Gemara. Well, the third group of angels know better than to object to God. And they say, we won't argue. Go and do what you want. God creates man, but after 1,000 years, we know from the stories in the Torah, man messes up. The generation of the flood, where the whole world was corrupt and immoral, and the generation of the Tower of Babel, where they were rebelling against God. So the angels come back to God. They have a long memory. They play the long game. When the first groups of angels right, maybe you shouldn't have made man. God says, I'm till old age, meaning I last forever. But I say but really, and I'm willing to bear man's iniquities, to bear man's shortcomings forever. Meaning, what we see from this Gemara is, indeed, the angels have a point. God endows human being with free choice, and invariably man messes up. Man throws back the gift of life and the gift of the world in God's face, rebel against God, not on an individual level even, the entire civilization, the entire world. Yet, and this is a source that is not such a well-known source, but there's a source perhaps maybe better known by Nahum Rabinovitch. The Torah tells us in Parshas Hazinu, towards the end of the Torah, Moses' poem, the Shira Hazos, the poem of Hazinu. What do we say? We say the rock, a reference to God, and the only time in the Torah that God is referred to as Tzur, a rock, and became, I guess, somewhat controversially, the euphemism for God that's used in the founding of the state of Israel, and we use it in the state for the prayer for the state of Israel. Tomim Palo, God's the rock, perfect are his actions, for all his ways are just. Keil Emunah. Then the verse says he is a God of faith. God of faith. And now I have messed up because I haven't given you the whole source. It should say Keil Emunah, Shehemin Ba'olamo Ubaro. I've cut off the words, I don't know why. What does it mean, a God of faith? It means that he had faith in the world and he created it. Incredible. Meaning, you're right. By endowing human beings with free will, as we saw in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, as the angels made very clear to God, and even after they told God to go ahead and create man, 1,000 years later they come back and say to God, we told you so. By endowing human being with free choice, the likelihood is, a good chance is, man will use that free choice for the bad and to mess up. Nonetheless, God says no. It's the first of God is a God of faith, meaning he has faith in the world, he has faith in us humans, even though he knows we're going to choose wrong sometimes, or many a time. Nonetheless, he created us. More, as Rabbi Sachs put it, more than the faith man has in God is the faith God has in man. The more in the Rambam says it more philosophically, meaning it could have been God's will the Shanus Teva Kolish, to change man's basic nature. B'bnei Adam. That God would program us to act in the way that He wants from us. He would make it easy for us to be moral, to be good, to adhere to His commandments. And the Sinas HaTorah Kula. But it says that Maimonides Rambam, had God done that, had God changed our natural temperament, our natural makeup of free will, of the balance we have between urge for good and for evil, had He done that, He would have done away with all the purpose of the prophets, really with the whole giving of the Torah, but more than just the giving of the Torah, the whole enterprise of the world and its creation. Well, fundamentally, it's a fundamental point in Judaism, of course, as religious people who believe in accountability and there's a purpose and meaning to our lives, that we're not predetermined. We have free choice. Yes, we mess up. That's the faith God has in us, that He gave us that free will, even though we will mess up. And for Him to take it away and to suspend it and to get rid of it would undermine not just the purpose of Torah and religion, but really the purpose of the world. That is the introduction. That God gives us free will, and God gives us the ability to choose. Then Rabbi Nahum Rabinovitch, here how he begins a very clever analysis, and he says, but the truth is, a child who's born doesn't really have free will. My 1-year-old, my 2-year-old doesn't have the capability to discern, to really be able to analyze, to learn, and to come to a place where perhaps is what Chazal say, that we're born with an evil inclination, which really means we're born with basic urges, with our instincts. But the good inclination, the Yitzhak, is something which has to be learned. The knowledge of to make the right moral choices, the knowledge of that which is right, needs growth, it needs maturation, it needs learning. A child who's young doesn't have that ability to really honestly choose, to make real choices with the two options and the two senses of feelings of knowing what's right and feeling what's wrong, and to make that choice in life. A child has to mature and go through a stage in order to get to that. This is what the Perish HaMishnah of the Rambam. So the Rambam writes, I'm going to give you a parable. What is the parable? A young child. Can people follow with my cursor? So a young child comes to the school, comes to the teacher to learn Torah. And this is eventually going to be the greatest gift you can give the child. By learning Torah, by being educated, he's going to come to be a complete, wholesome human being. Because he's a young child and he lacks intelligence and discerningness, he doesn't recognize the truth, the good, the inherent good that is in the subject matter that he's going to be taught. He doesn't understand the greater project here. By learning, by studying, by delving into God's word, that's going to bring him to his perfection, to his ultimate purpose. Therefore, how do you excite the child? How do you entice him into doing what you want him to do, i.e. to study and to learn? As I know very well, what do you do? What does the Rambam says? He said to him, learn. For the Rambam, it was nuts and figs. For me, it's chocolate and sweets. Yeah. Even a thing of sugar. Meaning, you have to entice the child for a completely, ulterior reason, for non-altruistic reasons, in order that he should do it. Okay. He goes on. When the child gets a bit older, he doesn't care so much for food and drink. You entice him by saying to him, "Look, I'll give you a nice piece of clothing. I'll give you the latest Nike shoes." That's what the teenager wants. And he goes on, and then they evolve a little bit more, and they recognize there's a value in this, not because I'm an ulterior motive of the food or the clothes I'm going to get, but because I'm going to get respect. I'm going to be called knowledgeable. People are going to give me respect because I have a PhD, because I have an MA, I have a BA, whatever it may be. They will study also for an ulterior motive, but more refined and a reason that gets closer to the essence of the thing itself. And eventually, a person will learn to do the thing. The Rambam writes in another place, to study and to delve and to adhere to the truth because of the truth, for no other reason, exterior to itself, to understand that what I'm doing is perfection in its own right, is the truth in its own right. Rabbi Nahum Rabinovitch used this parable of the Rambam in his commentary to the Mishnah to explain, so it is with Jewish civilization, really civilization at all, but he uses the Jewish people, and again, because if free will is human, is human perfection, is the gift of to humanity to use their free will to bring the world to perfection. That is us as our mission as Jews, to be those who show the world, ambassadors of the world, show the world how to use our free will and our moral code to bring the world to a better place. So he uses this parable of the Rambam to explain the development, the evolution of Jewish civilization. Jewish civilization didn't begin with a recognition. How could you expect it to be? And just like a child matures and needs to learn morality, needs to learn what's right, needs to learn the understanding of the truth because it is truth and not because of ulterior motives, so it is with Jewish civilization. Rabbi Nahum Rabinovitch brings the famous Gemara in Shabbos, in Peiches 88a, which is the pages in the Gemara which describe the giving of the Torah. The Torah tells us, "Vayisiyatu b'tachtis hahar," the Jewish people stood under the mountain. Amar Avdimi bar Chama bar Chasa. So, from the language of the Torah, it doesn't say they stood by the mountain. It could have said, and they stood al yad hahar, by the mountain, But underneath, what does it mean underneath the mountain? God suspended the mountain over the Jewish people, again, metaphorically, over the Jewish people like a barrel. And he said to him, if you accept the Torah, all well and good. And if not, this will be the end of Jewish history. This idea that the Jewish people were in some sense, and again, this is a discussion, what exactly were they coerced into? Why were they coerced? But nonetheless, there seems to be some level of coercion going on. That's where Rav Yaakov said if there was coercion, here you have a claim against the validity of the acceptance of the Torah. How could it wasn't done, completely out of our free choice, out of our free will. God had to superimpose it upon us. Amarava, that's what Rabbi says, even if that is so, that there was a level of coercion of the giving of the Torah at the time of Sinai, the Jewish people re-accepted the Torah again, Purim's coming up, in the time of Achashverosh, some 1,000 years later. The Torah, the Megillah, the scroll of Esther tells us that that the Jews accepted and established upon themselves. What does it mean? The Gemara says they accepted what they had already accepted, meaning they re-accepted the Torah, the covenant of the Torah with God again in the time of Achashverosh. Says Rashi, Bimei Achashverosh. Why in the days of Achashverosh? Why now? Why then, in the midst of that 70-year exile between the first and second temple? What then chose them? If anything, it would be the last time they would want to enter into a relationship and once again accept the Torah. This is when God had banished them from the temple. So it says Rashi, no, because of the miracle of being saved under after the decrees of Haman, the Jewish people once again accepted the Torah. What do we see from here? We see the Jewish people like a child at the moment of conception, really, that or birth, Egypt, giving of the Torah, the birth of the Jewish nation. We were like a child, a young child. The Rambam talks, who can't recognize truth, who doesn't recognize, who hasn't developed and evolved and matured to become a sophisticated, understanding nation state. There was a certain sense that if it had to be hoisted upon them, God saved us against our will, took us out of Egypt in many ways, and he had to force us, that you have to force the child to learn by giving him, the sweets and chocolates. So to God had to, in a way, force us to accept the moral code, to accept the Torah. We matured, and over 1,000 years, and this is again an anti of the theology of the Yeridat Hador, this idea that there's a diminution of the generations, rather that perhaps there's an evolution and a progression, that is, over the 1,000 years from the giving of the Torah. Now the Jewish people are actually ready, not to be forced to accept the Torah, but at this point they accepted of their own will. But as Rashi points out, it was also from an ulterior motive. This reason, it was like the child who studies Torah not for the sweets and chocolates, that's petty, but for the honor, or for some other ulterior, a more noble ulterior motive, but nonetheless an ulterior motive. This time in history, they accepted it from what reason? Because of the miracles. Miracles from God. They start to recognize, not out of the fear of God that God is going to destroy them. Now they love God, the love of God, that for what God has done for them, there's still an ulterior motive involved. Fast forward another 1,000 years, so a bit less, another 400 or 500 years, Ta'antignish is Socham. Ta'antignish is Socham, this is the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Kibo Mishrim Sadik, who are your Omer? Famous Mishnah, don't be like servants that serve the rabbi, the master really, in order to receive reward. Rather be like slaves or servants that serve the master, not for the sake of receiving reward. So now we've got to another stage of development, where we see the Jewish people as at a stage are ready to be taught the teaching that we're starting to do that which is right, to keep the Torah, to learn God's Torah, to be in a relationship with God, not because he's forcing us, not from ulterior motives, because of the miracles he does for us, not to receive any reward. Again, more of a recognition of the truth, because it's true. Not to serve God for a reward, to serve God because it is the right thing to do, a recognition of that. Interestingly enough, Rabinovitch quotes from the Masechta Ketana, the Rabinovitch to Rabbi Nosson, a commentary, early commentary, really a Tanaic commentary, a Talmudic commentary on the Mishnah, that already explains that perhaps even that generation wasn't quite ready. The Jewish people at that point wasn't mature enough to hear this message of serving God for no ulterior motives. Because who were his two students? This man, this rabbi, this great sage, he had two students. Who taught his words, his message of not serving God for any reason or not serving God for any reward. But they taught it to their students to their students. These students started to wonder, to probe. Why did our fathers, why did our teachers teach us such a thing? Is it possible for a worker to work for the master all day and then not to take any reward home at night? This is an aside. So the obviously Rabbi Sinosa said, well, had they recognized, had they believed in a world to come and in the resurrection of the dead, they would have never said such a thing. They would have recognized that there is a reward for serving God. It's just not in this world. But because of this question, how can it be we serve God for no other reason because it's true, and we just want to do it for the sake of doing it, for the sake of the truth, not for any ulterior motive, not to receive a reward? Therefore, they left the Torah. And who came from these students? Sedukim ubaisusim, the Sadducees and the Baitutim. So interestingly, Rabbi Nahum links these two together, meaning we got to a page of maturation. The Jewish people have got to a certain state, but perhaps even in that point, they weren't fully ready. So this is his and then he said we developed a stage later. The Gemara in Yuma tells us that another 300-400 years after Antignish Isocho, that's when the rabbis pray. No, not the 200 years, around that time, a century or so later, the rabbis prayed for the dissolution of the temptation of idolatry. So many understand it in a way. A classical way of understanding it is that, well, the Jewish people had got to a place where they could no longer tolerate it. They just were sinning, and if you read the books of Tanakh, you read the prophets, they're bemoaning again and again the idolatrous practices of the Jewish people, and it plagued them through the Second Temple even. Look at the Greek, the Greeks put Zeus up, and it was the Hellenized Jews. This idea that the Jewish people had succumbed, they just couldn't stand to it. But Rabinovitch reads it in a different way. The dissolution and the annulment of the Yetzer Hara for idolatry, for the inclination, for the urge for idolatry, was actually perhaps a natural progression. The Jewish people had indeed matured and advanced, and what was a normative behavior, as Rambam famously writes, by the karbanot, by the sacrifices for a slave community in a pagan society like Egypt. It was obvious you offer sacrifices to the gods. How could God demand of them immediately not to offer sacrifices? So he transposed it to be sacrifices for a monotheistic God. But the idea is that the Jewish people grew out of a certain reality, of a certain civilizations with certain ideas, and idolatry and the idea of either a society, a society with many gods was natural and normal for them. You couldn't expect them to give up on that. But there's a maturation, as Rabinovitch argues here. There's a maturation. There's the more, as a society, as a Jewish people, we imbibe and we ingrain the values and ideas of Torah and build a society around that and mature and develop the Torah, we get to a place where indeed the people, civilized Jewish people, are ready to let go of their idolatrous practices. So that's this introductory piece, the advancement that of and how the Torah expects, and this is what we're going to see. The next point is the Torah sets it up as it's all not going to happen overnight. That there's an advancement, there's a maturation, there's a development of Jewish society, just like there's a maturation of an individual child, to get to a point where you'll be able to exercise your free will better, that your choices will be purer choices between good and evil, where we'll really be dealing in pure good and pure evil, or pure good, i.e., rather than a more compromised position. And this is where it gets a little bit more radical and a bit more controversial. He now applies this to certain mitzvahs in the Torah, also to certain elements in the Torah. So the first one he takes is this. We see in Bereshit, he discovers Chava, right? God takes he puts him to sleep, takes part of his body, and he separates already. There were two beings in one, and he separates them out to man and to woman. Therefore, the Torah says a man will forsake his father and his mother, and he will cleave to his wife. It's clear from the very beginning of the Torah. Unlike other animals, God creates other animals, male and female. When it comes to humans, God creates them as one, and then he splits them off to be reunited. This idea that really man and woman are one, they're one unit. And when a person finds their spouse, a man finds a wife finds a husband, ideally they're supposed to be that one unit, them, the two of them are solely the two of them forever. Meaning, in the Torah's perspective, as we see the famous Gemara in Gittin, someone who divorces their wife, there's a sense of even the altar Christ here is, meaning on an ideal level, should be, one man, one woman for life together, right? For instance, the Gemara here I brought in Yuma, it talks about the Kohen Gadol. So the Kohen Gadol had to be married, based on a verse when he did the service on Yom Kippur. And he had a spare wife, because what if one wife died, he wouldn't have a wife, so they arranged for him a spare wife. The Gemara, I'm not going to go into it, has to deal with, well, how did they do it? Like, what was the arrangement? He couldn't be married to two women at once. That's what we're going to address. So they had to make this whole halachic contraption. He was married to one, but he would automatically marry the second one as if the first one died. It's sort of like a marriage on condition. So why couldn't he be married to two people at once? Why couldn't he just marry two wives? That was allowed. Polygamy was allowed. That he has to atone for himself and for his household, but not for two households. Meaning, the Gemara is telling us the high priest, the chief rabbi of the Jew, the greatest Jew, the holiest Jew, could only have one wife. Meaning, we see even if polygamy existed, the ideal was one man, one woman forever. Nonetheless, the Torah had to build in dispensations. The reality is not everyone got on together all the time, and the reality is people wanted to marry more than one wife. But then we developed. So you already see the Gemara in the Shulchan Aruch in Even Ezer tells us, Amar Rabbi So at a certain point, it was much easier to divorce one's wife. But as Rabinovitch presents, as there's a maturation, there's a development, trying to recapture, really, we start to actualize and realize the ideal of having lifelong marriages. Halacha made it more difficult to divorce one's wife. You couldn't do it against her will. Or the famous Rabinovitch from the last source, Hechrem al Hanosi al Ishta. Al Hanosi al Ishta, yeah, to marry on his wife, meaning to marry more than one wife. So Rabinovitch sees these halacha, the development of halacha in this area, as really a realizing of the ideals of one man, one woman for union together. And even if originally in biblical times this wasn't realized, the ideal was differently, and we are actually getting closer to the ideal than further away from it. That's to do with marriage. More controversially is the next example he brings. Famous Mishnah in Sanhedrin, Lefichach nivra adam yechidi. Man is created single, meaning God creates one man, one human being. Adam doesn't create like could have created millions of human beings. The whole nation creates one human being. Why? Anyone who kills one individual, it's as if you've destroyed the whole world. And if you bring life to one individual, you've upheld the whole world. This is another point. Another reason. Why did man create humanity to all stem from one individual? God could have created many individuals, and different nations would have come from different forefathers. No, he wants everyone to come from one individual. In order there should be peace amongst humanity. One man shouldn't say, one person shouldn't say to the other person, my forefather, my forebearer, my originator is greater than yours. And famously, this also tells us the greatness of God. A person mints many coins in one mint, and they're all the same. God, however, he mints all of us in one mint, I like Adam, and no person, two people are alike. What do we see from this Mishnah basically? We see that the Torah clearly endows each and every human being with equal status. Each and every human being has ultimate dignity. Look what Eov says. In Emas Mishpat Avdi v'amasi b'ribim amari, if I will despise the justice of my servant or my maidservant when they quarrel with me, what will I do when God arises? When he takes an accounting, what will I respond? Are we all not from one womb? We're all not formed in the same way. What is Eov saying? That yes, the reality is human beings subjugate other human beings. We're not all equal. There was slavery, there was servitude, there was subjugation. But nonetheless, Eov recognizes that in essence, that's a human construct. It's not endowed into creation that there's some humans who are higher and some humans are lower. We're all from the same place. And that's, you see, from the creation of the man, creation of the world, human beings should have all been equal, endowed with the same dignity. Nonetheless, as we know, that's not how human civilization, how human history evolved. Our Parshios. Paro enslaves not just one individual. We see from the Torah he enslaves a whole society, a whole class, a whole nation of individuals. These are the Parshios we're learning. And the Torah itself has a laws and has a reality of slavery, of servitude. The Torah tells us you're going to be able to acquire servants and maidservants from the people who dwell around you. Someone's got a chat. Sorry, no problem. So you see, the Torah itself has legislates for slavery. Nonetheless, so what would conclude from that? So many say, look, the Torah believes in slavery. There's so many halacha around it. The Torah tells us you can go ahead and have a slave, and this is how you treat the slave, and Jewish slaves go out after X amount of time, non-Jewish slaves remain with you forever. We'll focus on both. What do some people say? It's a mitzvah to have a slave. It's a Torah value to have a slave. It's a Torah morality to have slaves. Says Rabinovitch, no. Ideally, that's not the state of the world. That shouldn't be the case. But why does the Torah therefore have it? Because the Torah has to legislate. The Torah is dealing with a reality that it was, with a unredeemed, an unmatured, a reality that wasn't in its ultimate state. But the Torah nonetheless foresaw and wanted humanity, and specifically Jewish civilization, to get to a point where there wouldn't be slaves. The economics of the ancient world it was impossible to have a society without slaves. It just wasn't possible. The world couldn't function without slave labor, without that reality. Nonetheless, don't tell me that's an ideal. Don't tell me that's a value. Because we even see within the Torah itself, it puts so many limitations on the laws of slavery. It humanizes slavery. It dignifies the existence of a slave. For instance, non-Jewish slave, if you injure them, if you kill them, there's nokim. There is justice to be enacted. Meaning they're not just property. They're not just chattel. Furthermore, Shabbos applies to the man ben amosecha, the servant, the maidservant in your house. They also have to get relaxation. If the Torah really believed in hard slavery and this division of humanity into the masters and to the slaves, then the slaves would be treated like they were in many ancient societies and not such ancient societies, with no rights, with no dignity, with no mercy at all. Another example, the Rambam writes, if you sell your slave, you shouldn't, to a non-Jew, they go free. And the master is forced to free him. Meaning, and this is a little bit of a side point, meaning part of why the Torah legislates for slavery is it's a way of enveloping and involving the non-Jews in the society within a Jewish framework. If you're creating in Israel a Jewish and halachic, and talking about ancient Israel, halachic society, which under the dominion of God, now how do you deal with the fact that there will be non-Jews in your midst? So he says slavery, which creates a quasi-status of Jewry. I mean, we're not going into this now, but slavery creates a quasi-status of Judaism, endows even the non-Jews with a sort of a quasi-status amongst the Jewish people. But if you go ahead and sell them to a non-Jew, you've undermined one of the purposes of having slaves, and therefore that slave goes free, because there's no longer that purpose. You no longer got the right to say that they should remain a slave. Interesting, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Kashatovstu Rabbi Elazar ben Partu Rabbi Chanani betradio. So one said to the other, Ashrecha shenitlas ba'al davar echad, you, praiseworthy be you, because you were only arrested for one thing. Woe to me that I was arrested for 5 things, and therefore I'm in trouble. They've got 5 charges against me. What was one of them? That you released your servant to freedom. Rashi explains, the Romans had decreed against this. This was a Jewish thing. Free slaves? What's this idea of freeing slaves? So again, we see here that through the Torah, through the development of halacha, there's a development of more and more rights to slaves, and more of an anti-slavery agenda in halacha. A third example. So we had about marriage and how there was dispensations, but there's an ideal that society in Judaism and halacha is really developing to a state where we'll go back to the ideal. Slavery, just because the Torah has halachas of slavery, many halachas, and it's a reality, and it was a reality, and it's legislated, so to speak, by the Torah. You therefore might think it's a Torah value, it's a moral, it's a positive moral thing in the Torah that's okay with it. The answer is yes. If you read the text and on a technical halachic, on a plain level, yes. But if you see it through the world, through an understanding, there's a maturation, there's a development, that the Torah really wants us to get to a point what it envisaged of every human being be equal, and there shouldn't be slaves, then no, the Torah doesn't want us to have slavery. And in a way, we're in a much better place now in 2021 than they were in the times of Moshe and Joshua and the rabbis of the Talmud when they did have slaves, and that was a reality. Thank God. Rabinovitch will say we've developed to a place where we are able to live out the Torah ideal in a more ideal way. Third example is peace. The verse tells us to hit him, seek out peace and chase after it. And as Micha says, you say this thing, each person they will bend their swords into plowshares, right? And they won't be, there'll be no more war, there'll be no more swords. Each man will sit under his fig tree and under his vine, and there won't be fear. Meaning the Torah's idea is an ideal world of peace, of getting along. And yet, the Rambam writes, and we know this from the Torah, I just bring the Rambam because he he summarizes it well. One of the jobs of the king is to wage a war and to destroy the 7 nations and to wage a war of obliteration, annihilation against Amalek. Meaning, yes, the Torah's ideal is peace, is living peaceably, is not fighting wars. Yet the Torah has to be real with the reality of the human experience of human history, that there are wars and that nations don't get along with the other. And if you don't have a strong army, you don't have a strong government, and you can't defend yourself, you'll just be swallowed up. You'll have no existence. Nonetheless, and this is a beautiful medrash in Tanchuma, the verse tells us, the verse in Proverbs 3, the ways of Torah are ways of pleasantness. And all the paths of Torah are peace. About Torah. Everything that's written in the Torah, l'shem or l'shum shalom hu nichtav, it's written for the purpose of peace. This is the Medrash Tanchuma. It's a Tanaic literature. Even though in the Torah there's written about wars, l'shem shalom nichtav. They aren't wars for the sake of wars or the sake of conquest or the sake of armies and empires. It's for the sake of peace. Even the legislation, even the halachic imperatives for war are for the grander purpose of achieving peace. And therefore there's many halachas. You have to extend out a hand of peace before of reconciliation and of peace before you go ahead and fight the person. Meaning the ideal is a world of peace. And even though the Torah has halachas around war, don't tell me that somehow the Torah wants war. That it wants, that it wants us to fight these people. Really, ideally, it should be a world of peace. Nonetheless, there's a maturation, there's a development of humanity towards that. Where does this all get us? We're going to skip. Actually, I've got only 2 more slides. So if people will stick with me, we will share them. Where Rabinovitch is basically arguing, and he says it in a slightly different formulation in the second part of the essay, is there's 2 types of Torah commandments. This is where it really gets quite controversial, and please listen carefully, because this needs qualification, this needs understanding. There are those commandments that are destined to endure. They are absolute truth for all humanity, for all of history, for the end of days and beyond. And then there are commandments in the Torah, positive commandments, and often negative commandments, that were not meant to endure. They were meant to be for as long as they were needed to be. As we saw in the case of slavery, of war, of perhaps of divorce, of polygamy, of these things, as long as they are realities, as long as they need to be, as long as humanity, or specifically the Jewish people, have got to a stage where they become obsolete, they're there. But we're developing, we're trying to go in a direction where they will become obsolete. Now you have to be very careful, because we believe, and the Rambam writes, that the Torah doesn't change. And it's absolute morality, meaning if God commanded us something, the idea of it's written in the blueprint of the world, Torah isn't somehow, and if it's God's words to us, it's God's covenant with us, it's not up for change. It's not up for, it's not up for, reconsidering and rewriting it every centuries. That's not what we're talking about here. And he brings an example from here. He said there are certain laws on the Torah there never was. The laws of the wayward child, right? The child who eats meat on the streets and he doesn't listen to his parents, he's killed as a child. And why? The whole discussion. The Talmud tells us it never was. There was never a case. This law never happened. The whole discussion in the Torah, the pages in the Talmud, it never happened. Why is it written? In order to study it and to receive reward. It brings another example. The example of Irani Dachas, the city that gets destroyed, a city where everyone in the city was serving idols. And we annihilate the whole city. The Gemara says it never was. That never happened. There was never such a case. Why again do we have it? Nidrosh for the Kabbalah, to study about it, the laws, and to receive reward, but not to actually ever put it into practice. And the third one, about a house with sarach, with leprosy. So what's going on here? What does it mean to Rosh Rabinovitch? The whole point of these laws is to study them, that they should never happen. The point is that we teach our kids about the Ben Sarah Mara, about the wayward child, about what happens when a young person becomes hedonistic and insolent and just feeds their own desires and they throw off the shackles of society and of authority, this is what will happen to you. But we teach us for them for the purpose that they should never happen, that they should never come to be. And so to the Iranidach, it's a warning that every Jewish community, every Jewish city should learn these laws and understand there is consequences. This is not just a morally indifferent world. There's consequences. If you act in a certain way, it's upon Jewish community, Jewish society, the base and the authorities to clamp down on you, to shut you down, to destroy you if need be. But the point is that we don't want you to get them. So too many of the laws of the Torah, they are realities. They're not to change. They can't be written out in the books. They are a truth and will remain a truth forevermore. They are on a fundamental level. They are a truth. Perhaps, but as Rabinovitch is saying, but at least some of them, the point of some of them is this very point, is to give us a vision of where we should get to, a dispensation to deal and to perhaps soften and to humanize that human frailty, that the shortcomings of civilization. But in reality, we hope to get to a point where in practice they'll never be able to be carried out. Indeed, once the 7 nations were destroyed, that mitzvah was no longer practicable. It's still true. It's still there, but it's no longer practicable. So too is the destruction of Amalek and various things like that. To quote Rabbi Nahum Rabinovitch, a nation that internalizes the Torah's ideas and values slowly builds up immunity against shameful seductions. Of course, with generations, students of Torah develop modes of critical thinking that from life through issues, distinguishing illusion from reality, imaginings from truth, vain puffery from glorious responses to God's voice. He said this, and this development goes back and forth. Sometimes we got to a place where we were more developed, and then we lapsed back into a place where we were less moral, less developed. But nonetheless, these remain absolute truths, and that's why it becomes difficult, and you have to have someone like Rabbi Rabinovitch or others to tell us, well, which of the commandments are things where they were a value or they were a bottom, so they were a minimum, but not necessarily the maximum, not necessarily the ideal. And where do we say, no, that is something that is still a Torah value, and it might not sit comfortably with us. Slavery doesn't sit comfortably with us, and that's why this approach is very useful. As I said, for me, like, how do we square up the fact that the Torah legislates and has all these laws about slavery and servitude, and why should the Torah even have that? Surely, we live in a much better, more moral society now that doesn't have slavery. Surely the Torah should have been where we were in the 21st century. The answer is the Torah wanted us to get to where we are in the 21st century, at least in this element. But it had to have it for the reality of the time. And it's very useful. But to know where to extend this idea and to what to apply it to, that's more complicated. And that's why I said it can be a slippery slope, a dangerous. And let's just conclude. I know the hour is late, with some words from the end of the essay itself. Here I read. Our age, and this is very, again, for me, Rabbi Nahum Rabinovitch gives us a very empowering, a very uplifting view of, we so often see ourselves, as this, we're so far away, we're so much lower than we once were, we're such a difficult spot. But he says, no, we're actually in a much greater spot than we think. We're in an age of great opportunity, of greatness. Our age is characterized by the widespread view that individual liberty is a value greater than any other human deed. Indeed, we are in the age of individuality, of autonomy, of individual liberty. Perhaps that's why many are struggling with the lockdowns and things like that, with these government rules. There is much that is good about the phenomenon, for only one who values free choice can come to recognize how the choice should be used to advance lofty spiritual goals. And even though our generation compares poorly to its predecessors with respect to faith and religious observance, its deepened sense of individual liberty represents definite progress over past achievements. Until modern times, there prevailed an authoritarian worldview which regarded discipline as the highest value. Today, liberty enjoys the highest value. Only a person conscious of his power to choose can act entirely out of free will. So as we started coming back, free will can be best expressed in a world that doesn't have so much external pressures, but perhaps a world where we really feel and we live in a value system where we totally choose of our own right. And indeed, that can be fair. This is the final paragraph. In educating a child, one proceeds gradually from fear of punishment to appreciation of reward and beyond, step by step. The parent's efforts are accompanied by a firm belief that at the conclusion of the long process, when the child attains the age of maturity, at which his or her own free will can be effectuated, he or she will choose the good and the true for its inherent value and not merely because of external considerations. It appears, skipping a few lines, that our generation is nearing the state of national maturity, the age at which the human soul recoils from anything imposed on it against its will. And there's no better guarantee that humanity is on the threshold of the great era in which in the image of God within us will appear in all its glory. Their powerful hope that the entire nation was progressing towards these heights led our sages of blessed memory to regard each restriction of the power to compel as a step to preparing the world to accept the kingdom of heaven. We didn't get into it, but if you think about it now, the power of Beis Din, of Jewish authority to impose halacha on us is gone. Rather, we're in an age where we choose it of our own free will. Well, the only way we adhere to halacha is because we're choosing it, because not have any external influence of external power. There's no one forcing us to do it. He said that's actually an ideal. We've come to a place where not only conscious and aware, highly aware of our liberty, of our individual liberty, but also with very few external powers and external forces acting upon us to behave in a certain way. Perhaps in many ways we've reached a high point in civilization of history, where indeed we are exercising the greatest gift, the greatest sign of our humanity, our free choice, that image of God that we are, to be able to choose to do the right thing for the right purposes, because we've got to a place where we recognize the highest levels of morality, rather than not.